This woman was denied entry to university, so she founded America's first Catholic school. Have you ever wondered what happens to a brilliant mind when the world tells her no? There was a young woman in New York, sharp as anyone in the room, who wanted nothing more than a real education, and the university doors closed on her, not because she lacked the mind for it, but simply because she was a woman. It's easy to miss the quiet irony here. That closed door didn't stop her. Instead, it became a kind of blueprint for a door she would build herself, one that would swing open for thousands of children who had nowhere else to go. This is the story of a widow with 5 children and empty pockets who ended up founding the first Catholic school system in America. Stay with me, because the woman on the other side of this story is not who you'd expect. Elizabeth Seton grew up inside New York's high society, drawing rooms, dinner parties, and a certain expectation about what a young woman's life should become. She was well-read, curious, quick with ideas, but the university doors simply weren't open to her, and that was the way of the world back in the 1700s. In 1794, she married William McGee Seton, a wealthy merchant with a growing shipping business, and 5 children followed one after another. For a while, life looked settled and secure, with comfortable rooms and a husband who was a successful businessman. The Seton money came from New York's harbor, from ships going out and cargo coming in, through the machinery of trade that kept the city running. Thousands of crates stacked on the docks, ledgers full of numbers. William had a hand in the bustling trade of goods crossing the Atlantic. For a time it worked, then it didn't. The 1790s brought disruption to the shipping trade. Routes disturbed, markets shaken, and the Seton fortune simply didn't survive. Debts piled up faster than income could cover them, and the comfortable life Elizabeth had known started coming apart at the edges, piece by piece. And then came something worse than money trouble. William got sick with tuberculosis, the disease that took so many in that era, and the doctors of the time believed warm air might ease the suffering. So the family did what desperate families do. They packed up and sailed for Italy, chasing a climate that might save him. Sadly, it did not. William died abroad, far from home, leaving Elizabeth a widow at 29, alone in a foreign country with 5 children who depended on her for everything. Let's sit with that for a moment. A young mother, 29 and grieving, stranded thousands of miles from anything familiar, with no husband, no income, and 5 small faces looking to her for what came next. Grief has a way of making decisions for you sometimes, and Elizabeth had no real choice but to gather her children and sail back to New York, back to the city she had grown up in, though nothing about her circumstances resembled the comfort of her childhood. She needed to survive, and survival meant work. So she did what a woman with her education could do, and opened a small classroom. Only this time, she wasn't the student anyone had turned away. She was the one standing at the front of the room, keeping her family fed one lesson at a time. Back in New York, Elizabeth opened a small academy for young ladies. Nothing fancy, just a room, some books, a way to bring in enough to keep her children fed. But something had followed her home from Italy. Something quieter than grief and harder to explain to the neighbors. While she'd been overseas, staying with friends of William's, she'd been exposed to Catholic worship for the first time. The Mass, the Eucharist, a kind of steadiness she hadn't expected to find in the middle of losing everything. She watched families kneel together in a way that felt different from anything in her Episcopal upbringing, and it stayed with her long after the ship carried her back across the Atlantic. She sat with it for a while. Elizabeth wasn't the type to rush a decision like this, and this was no small thing. On March 14th, 1805, she formally converted to Roman Catholicism, leaving behind the Episcopal faith she'd known since childhood. Quiet on paper, loud in every room she used to belong to. The part I find especially interesting is what this meant in her world. New York in 1805 wasn't a place where anti-Catholic feeling was a fringe attitude held by a few cranks. It ran through colonial and early American culture like a current under the surface, suspicion of Rome baked into how people saw the world, how they raised their children, who they let into their homes. Converting to Catholicism in Elizabeth's world wasn't a private matter of conscience. It was a public act with real consequences. And the consequences came fast. Friends who'd known her for years began pulling away. Family members grew cold, distant, some cutting contact altogether. Parents who'd trusted her with their daughter's education started withdrawing them from her academy, one by one, until the very thing keeping her family fed began to disappear along with her social standing. Let's sit with that for a moment. This is the real rejection story here, not that university door closed years earlier. That was one door, closed for one reason. This was an entire social world, the same one she'd grown up inside, shutting itself against her because of what she believed. Worse than any classroom she'd been kept out of. This was exile from the only life she'd ever known. By the time it was over, Elizabeth had almost nothing left in New York. No students, no income, no social circle willing to stand beside her. And that's exactly when an invitation showed up from Baltimore, from men who'd heard about a widow with a sharp mind and a new faith, who saw in her something the church in America needed badly. Bishop John Carroll, who I discussed in another video, and a group of Sulpician priests were behind that invitation. They'd heard about Elizabeth, her mind, her faith, her willingness to start over with nothing, and they sensed in her something the church in America badly needed. Not a donor, not a patron, someone willing to build from the ground up. So Elizabeth headed south, first to Baltimore, then further out to a quiet stretch of Maryland called Emmitsburg. Picture the distance for a moment, not just in miles but in everything else. New York had given her drawing rooms, dinner parties, a whole social order built on who your family was. Emmitsburg gave her open fields and a handful of buildings and almost nothing familiar at all. For a woman raised the way she'd been raised, it must have felt like landing on the moon. But she got to work. On July 31st, 1809, Elizabeth formed a religious community devoted to caring for children of the poor. This wasn't just a group of women saying prayers together. It became the first congregation of religious sisters ever founded on American soil, something that had never existed here before her. There was no template, no other American foundress to look to for guidance. She was building the very shape of religious life in this country as she went. Then, on February 22nd, 1810, she opened the first Catholic school in Baltimore, built from almost nothing, for children who genuinely had nowhere else to learn. No wealthy patrons lining up, no guarantee it would even last past the first winter. Here's the detail that gets me every time I sit with this story. That school in Emmitsburg didn't charge tuition. It was free. Poverty was no disqualifier. A child could walk in with empty pockets and still get an education, still learn to read, still be treated like their mind mattered. In a country where schooling still belonged mostly to families who could afford it, that was close to unheard of. And that one decision, made by a widow with almost no money of her own, planted the seed of something much larger. The entire Catholic parochial school system that eventually spread across America traces its roots back to what happened in that small Maryland town. Every parish school that came after, every free Catholic classroom in every city, all of it grows out of what Elizabeth started with barely more than her own hands and a handful of sisters willing to work beside her. There's something worth sitting with here. The woman once told she couldn't sit in a university lecture hall, ended up authoring an entire structure of American Catholic education, brick by brick, sister by sister, school by school. Nobody handed her that. She built it herself, out of grief and poverty and a faith that had cost her everything she used to have. And her story doesn't end with her death. It keeps unfolding, long after she's gone. I've always found something beautiful in the way the church confirmed what the sisters in Emmitsburg already knew. On September the 14th, 1975, Elizabeth Ann Seton became the first person born in what we now call the United States to be canonized. But this wasn't a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. It was Rome quietly saying yes to what the sisters and school children had known for over a century. Let's sit with the arc of it for a moment. A university door closed on a young woman because she was a woman. A whole social world closed its doors because she had become a Catholic. And then generations later, the church itself opened its doors as wide as they go, declaring her a saint. That arc from rejection to embrace tells us something about how grace works. There's something beautiful in that, isn't there? And I think that's worth sitting with. The schools that trace back to her are still teaching children today. That's not a metaphor, it's an actual inheritance still standing and still doing what she built it to do. And here's a detail I find almost too fitting to be real. In 1856, her own nephew founded a university and named it Seton Hall. The very kind of institution that had shut its doors to her decades earlier now carries her name over the entrance. So maybe that's the thing worth carrying out of this story. The door that closes on you might be the exact door you're meant to build yourself, just somewhere you never expected to look. There's a quiet courage in that thought, and perhaps that's the real gift her story leaves us. I hope you'll sit with Elizabeth's story a while longer, because there's more in it than one video can hold. If this kind of story is one you want more of, stay close. And if you're curious what happens when faith and public life collide even further, take a look at my video about Charles Carroll. Somewhere in Emmitsburg tonight, the school she started is still standing.